Welcome to Whispers from the Phylactery. Today we're talking about something every game master wrestles with at some point, and that's boss encounters. These big climactic moments, then the epic final showdowns, the villains that you've been foreshadowing for 6 sessions or maybe 6 months. So, how do you make those encounters actually feel like a boss fight and not just another stat block in another fancy hat? So, if you're new, I like to talk about various aspects of tabletop role playing games, from encounters to styles of play and systems in general, with a healthy dose of occasional rambling. And if that's your style, then let's get into it. So, what makes a boss? Boss can mean a lot of things, and it depends on your game system and the table culture. But in most games, and in my games, it's the encounter that's meant to be memorable at the end of a story beat. Usually, they're climactic, high stakes, and excessively dramatic if you feel like really amping it up. And the mistake I see newer GMs kind of make the most often is just using bosses as enemies with extra hit points. They're just a slightly upgraded mook, but we'll make them a bullet sponge and give them extra 30 or 40 hit points, and it'll be fine. It's just like putting a crown on a goblin and calling it a king. It doesn't really make it a goblin king. A true boss to me should be a narrative moment and not just a mechanical one. So we really should ask ourselves, what story does the boss represent? What's the story beat? What are the consequences riding on this fight or this showdown? And what emotional or thematic threads are coming to a head? So you're really not just running a boss combat, you're trying to deliver payoff for the story so far. So before initiative, we really should look at what happens before the dice hit the table. So I like to try and set my scenes for boss fights a little bit more descriptively, and really lean into it. So where is this epic showdown happening? What's the mood? What's at stake? Maybe your players walk into a cathedral where their voices echo against the marble halls, and the enemy is already waiting in silence, praying at the head of the cathedral at the ritual stone. Or maybe they've kicked open the door and they find the boss mid-ritual in the cultist's lair. Uh, or if you're going for a more political or noble-based game, maybe they meet the boss for dinner and the fight doesn't begin until dessert, where everyone's on their best toes with daggers behind their smiles. And unlike a lot of other enemies or monsters where they might just say one occasional thing, bosses should try and have a voice throughout the build up and especially in the final confrontation, moment to monologue or plead or taunt. It doesn't have to be too long, just enough to remind the players that this particular encounter matters more so than others. If that's simply, I mean, a lot of people want to go on grand monologues, and then there's the typical trope of, I cast fireball. Nope, I don't want to listen to him. I shoot an arrow at him. Ideally, your players will let you have your moment because the GMs are also playing the game. And it's our job to make things fun and interesting for our players. And part of that comes from really getting to use our bad guys and our bosses. I I mean, so it's nice if players let you do your monologue or your little quip. I know mine haven't always, and it can be frustrating that you've spent a long time getting this boss ready and then it kind of just falls flat on its face. It falls into a simple mechanics, and that's never fun. So we're trying to figure out how not to do that. So, just in addition to that, to make them more special, we shouldn't forget about different systems' version of legendary layers and actions. Um, D&D has the legendary layer mechanic, Pathfinder has legendary actions and resistances, and then you can really amp up different combats. Although I apply this to all sorts of combats and not just boss encounters. Um, having environmental hazards in the combat. And then with bosses, you can do narrative timers, either a crumbling cliffside or a sacrificial countdown till a demon arises from the sacrifice. Um, a room flooding with arcane energy. Anything that reinforces the stakes without resorting to pure damage output, where you're just putting more pressure on the HP resource that players have, I think works a lot better. So, in combat, when initiative rolled, the map's out, or the theater of the mind is set for everybody, depending on what you're rolling with, what do you do now? So here are a few tips that I have. And let's be honest, some of these might seem common sense, but for newer players or even just a handy reminder for older DMs, it can be useful. We're looking at things like mixing up the pattern. Don't just spam the same attack over and over. At different stages of a fight, a boss might use different tactics. So if we take a dragon fight, for example, the first 25 HP or until they're forced to land, the dragon does strafing runs. And then a 25 HP reduction, one of their wings is clipped or something like that, and they fall down to the ground and they need to start using their claws and tail. Or if you're facing a cult leader at half health, the boss calls in reinforcements. Or if you're battling atop the upper pinnacle of a wizard's tower, the floor and tower crumble beneath you, and you end up falling into the next layer down. The battlefield changes, and you want to keep your players adapting instead of just relying on the same, oh, he's going to swing his tail or he's going to swing his club, and it's all the same thing over and over again. And then another thing is using the boss's personality. Does the villain fight with honor, cowardice, cruelty? Actions reflect characters. Let them role play during the combat. If you have a cowardly spy master, he's going to try and escape, trigger traps on the players. The brash warlord might try to actually order his men to stand down. They'd rather face a player one-on-one unless others intervene. And then it kind of jumps down to spotlighting the party and individual people in the party. So great boss fights give everybody a chance to shine. And the moment that the rogue disables the summoning crystal or the cleric protects the party from a soul-shattering scream, I mean, that really sticks in people's memories. A lot of games use class features to kind of do this thing where the soul-shattering scream does make me think of champions in Pathfinder, where they can use their reaction to give their allies a bonus on a check. But you can also do it narratively if the cleric is watching and ready, and this torrent of necrotic or void energy is building up, and you give the warning one round in advance that it is reaching a crescendo. As soon as something awful will happen, they might choose to try and protect their party, in which case, great, they can make a religion check, and if they succeed, the party gets a bonus on their saves. Having different parts where party members are useful to the combat in more ways than just damage can really stick with players. And well, it sticks with GMs too, and you end up remembering these great stories. And it helps to really, it's a general guideline, but players like to feel clever. I mean, GMs want to like to feel clever too. If one of our little tricks and traps works really well, we're happy. Players have fun. If players use the terrain properly or they recall a clue from earlier, then reward that. If they can find a means to bring theatrics and narrative into the game, we should encourage that to a degree. I am still more mechanics than fluff, but I think that we should really try and work with people to make these big cinematic scenes the best that we can. So after the dust settles, when the boss finally falls, whether it's by blade, spell, or in the case of a bard, a well timed pun, don't try and rush through the aftermath of the encounter. You can let the silence sit as your players celebrate, um, and they are super happy and they're doing all of their thing. Um, like every other encounter, ask your players what they want to do in the moment. Loot and XP are great, and they're the main driving force of a lot of our games. But the emotional fallout can be a real treasure if your table is open up to that. Um, Maybe someone wants to say a final line before the story beat closes, or maybe another character's scared of what the victory means. Um, you defeated the necromancer that's been plaguing the kingdom, but at what cost did it have to the land? And maybe other characters are just tired. They've been on this journey. They've potentially traveled weeks or months to defeat this ancient evil. I think it's good for characters to reflect on the cost or the questions that remain at the end of the encounter. Um, is it really just the end of the story beat, or is it the beginning of something worse down the line? The cult leader locally has a letter pointing you to a bigger city down the coast, and it appears that the murders aren't going to simply stop now that you've stopped this one cult outpost. You need to go and see what's wrong. And I think that emotionally, we can bring a lot of punch to things. Of course, this all does rely on players wanting to have that punch and bring it with them as well. If your table is a bunch of just roll happy, they just want to come play the game, smack some stuff, then your boss fights need to look a little bit different. You do want the big flashy monsters, but you don't want to just have more hit points. You want it to be unique moves or especially ramping up the environment. Um, One of my favorite boss encounters that I've run ended up with the party going to the plane of air. It was a small portal that they had to chase a thief through. They'd stolen a tuning fork, and it ended the little adventure and the story beat on a island hopping adventure and combat where there were floating islands in the plane of air, and the stone that was being cracked was summoning air elementals of different types. So the party needed to stop the thief and escape before too many air elementals were summoned. So boss fights should really be above and beyond, in my opinion. Um, it's never great if you finally get to the boss, and the worst thing that can happen for me is the players just sit there, they roll dice, there's very little emotion, and it's great. We beat the boss. Now, where's the loot and where do we go next? Like, what's next, GM? Point us in the way. We just need to go murder things. I try not to run those games just because I don't like that personally. But I suppose in the end, boss fights aren't about challenge ratings or stat math. They're about resonance and the story beats and the memory that your players carry with them after the campaign ends. So the next time you prep a boss fight, try and remember to give it a voice, give it weight, give it wonder, make them question and adapt from what they have before. And thank you for joining me today. If this was helpful, then I mean, you know the deal. We're on YouTube. Like, subscribe, or just tell your party on it. Tell your party about it on the road between towns. Um, until next time, adventurers.